guys, welcome to this new video in our series API Payment Integration with Paystack. In this video, we're going to develop a base API class which we will extend to integrate Paystack to our application. So let's dive right in. Now that we have our basic app structure set up with Docker and database, we would move to the crux of the matter, which is payment integration with Paystack. In order to integrate with Paystack or any other payment platform, we need authentication credentials. Before we delve into that, let's quickly navigate to Paystack website and get acquainted with documentation. So I'll move to the browser and go to paystack.com, and then developer section, I can see documentation. Here I can move to the APIs. So here, if we scroll down a little bit, you see the methods accepted are post, get, put, and delete, right? That can be made to Paystack APIs. You can see the request and response. Here we always have a status. We have a status message and data coming back from every request. So it's only true if the details provided could be processed, right? So you always see a true if it's successful, and then an appropriate message and the response data as expected. Next, if we move to authentication, right, you notice that to make any request to Paystack, you need to be authenticated, and that's done through the header. We have the authorization, and you pass bearer and the secret, which I explained earlier on. We'll get that shortly. So let's move to transactions. So in the transaction sections, we can see the first API here, which is initialize transaction. So this is to initialize a transaction, and the transaction URL will be generated that you can use to make payment request to Paystack. So you can see the success response here. We have status true, the message authorization URL created, and then the data contains the authorization URL. So if you move down a little bit, you see we have two required parameters here. We have the amount and the email. There are other optional parameters you can pass, like the currency, reference, callback URL, which is a fully qualified URL. Example, this is used to override the callback URL provided on the dashboard for transaction. We'll see that shortly when we get signed up. You have lots of other things you can actually really pass. You can actually take your time out to scroll through that and see what you can explore there. Next, you move to the second API that we'll also be using in this tutorial, which is the verify transaction. So this is to confirm the status of a transaction. So you can see here is a get endpoint that makes a call, and you pass the authorization, bearer, and your secret. Next, it gives you a full data of that particular transaction if it was successful. But if it's actually a failure, right, or it was abandoned at some point, or there was one reason or the other and it wasn't a successful transaction, you get an appropriate response here. And all said, so let's head over to sign up. So to sign up, it's actually very straightforward, right? You just create a free account here. So once it pops up, it gives you a simple form for you to fill. So before now, I already have an account, so I'll just go ahead and log into my created account. In settings, there's API keys and webhooks. I'll go there. So here I have the test secret key. So here you also see that I'll have the test callback URL, so you can set it to anything you want. So whenever the request is successful from Paystack point, it sends the response back to this URL here. We'll see how that plays out soon. So here I'll just copy the secret key and then have that stored in our environment variables, because we'll be needing now to make authenticated requests to Paystack. So I'll call it Paystack secret key. Next, we'll be needing the base URL from Paystack. in order to make requests. So if you look at the documentations, you have a base URL here, which is https api paystack.co. So I'll copy that. So I'll also store that in our application. So I'll save this and make this available in our config. Paystack secret process env. Next I have paystack URL process.env.entropy, and I'll save this. In order to carry out API calls from our application, it will be in order to create a base API wrapper class that provides clean function wrappers to carry out different HTTP request calls like post, get, put, patch, and delete. Our Paystack API class can extend this class to take advantage of these features. This class can also be used for other API integrations in our application. Node Fetch is a lightweight module that brings the features of Fetch API to Node. We will make use of this package as our underlying request module. So move over to install that from our terminal. npm install node fetch. And we also need to install the type definition. So once all is done, we can now create our base API class as discussed earlier. So we define our class. Class base API export default base API. Let's save that. Next, to create a class attribute, which is the base URL, and that will be a string to hold the base URL of the API being called. We can pass this as a parameter to the constructor, since every instance should have the same base URL. So URL string we passed in. So this dot base URL will be equal to the URL passed at creation time. Next, we can create a function that wraps around the fetch API for our node fetch module. This function should handle the vetting of our URL, constructing the body and the URL params accordingly. We have fetch. So it's definitely going to be an async function that will receive a URL, and that will be a string. So this is a relative path to the endpoint being called. Body should be an optional parameter, should be a body init, and this will be from node fetch. Optional args parameter, this should be a record. That's like an object that has a key as a string and a type of any as a value. Args will represent our URL params if there are. So next I have the request init, and is of type of request init, still from node fetch types. So this is the request option specific to the request. So add a function arrow here and save that properly format. So let's start building our function by properly constructing our URL string with URL params. We'll make use of the URL global object, which throws type error for invalid URLs. And since that throws an error, we need to wrap it in a try catch block. And through bad request error with the error message whenever it errors. Next, to go ahead to create a URL object using the URL global. We're passing the URL and an optional base URL param. So this creates a URL object. To properly construct our query string from the args, we'll make use of another global object called URL search params. If we have arguments passed in, we'll need to construct that. So let's say our query string equal to new URL search params. That's it there, and we'll pass in the args and we'll stringify it. So from our query string, we can actually add this to our URL object. So instead of passing this to a string here, we can just add it to the URL object search property, so that will properly construct our URL and our query params properly. The node fetch function takes two arguments, the URL and an optional parameter, which is the standard HTTP fetch option consisting of method, header, body, redirect, and signal, and additional node fetch extension. For more information on this, please check the documentation. Going forward, we'll need to create a new variable to hold this request option. So we'll have const request options equal to, so we'll just spread the request init in the params of this function, add the body. Finally, we can now call our node fetch function. Const response equal to await fetch. This fetch is from node fetch. Our URL object dot to string, and we can now pass our second optional parameter we created, which is the request option. So we can here check if the response was not okay. So if it's not a 200 response, we can get the error from the response, the error message from the response. Dot text and throw the new bad request error, passing the error message. Good. And now we can finally return our response.json. I missed the new here. Good. So save that. So now our function looks good. Here we constructed the URL object, we constructed the query params here, and here we added our HTTP request options. We spread the ones passed into the function and added our body. We made a fetch call here, passing the URL object, stringified URL object with both the URL and the query params, and also our HTTP request options. And we checked if the response was not okay, right? We returned a bad request to the error message from the response text, and here we returned a response JSON from the API. But wait a minute, what if we do not have a response, right? What if there's no content in the response, right? So this is going to throw an error. In order to handle about that, we will check if response.status if it's equal to status code dot no content, we'll just return. Next, we'll define a get method, which will just be a call to our fetch function, but setting the request method to get. So we're going to have the URL passed in, which would be the relative part, and args, if any, is going to be optional, and it could be string and the value of any. And next, to have a request in it, here we have no need for body. This is the get method. We're calling the fetch method and we're passing the URL. Next, we're passing undefined as the body and the args as the args. Then here we're going to spread the request in it passed in from the parameter and add a method get. Yeah, so since we're using TypeScript, we need to properly type this get function. So if you hover over it, you see that it returns a promise of any, right? Although our get function will actually return a type based on the API endpoint it's calling. To handle this in TypeScript, we use a generic, and it gives us the ability to pass arbitrary types to function. So the syntax goes as follows: we're going to pass an arbitrary type here t and infer that it returns that same type as a promise, since this is an async function. So I'll save that, and then when we hover over now, we'll see it's now properly typed. Nice. Next, we'll do something similar to the post request. The main difference from the get is that we're passing a body, and we're also stringifying that body and passing it to our fetch call. Next, we're setting the method to post. Great jobs, guys. I'll leave you to add functions for other verbs like delete, put, and patch. This video is already getting too lengthy. In our next video, we'll integrate with Paystack. Hope you enjoyed the video. Kindly click the subscribe button and turn on post notification to support and encourage the channel to create more feature focused content. Thank you.